Go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to the first online WLC annual meeting. We want to thank the presenters who agreed to share their ideas and insights with the WLC community, and we are grateful to all the attendees who have joined us today. This session is Cultivating Leadership in the Next Generation of Librarians, presented by Christina J. Alayan, the Law Library Director at Howard University, Emily Florio, Senior Research Services Manager at Hogan Lovells, Liz Graham, Head of Technical Services at University of Maryland. Each session will last 45 minutes. We will need to end on time so that the next session can begin on time. I will let you know when 5 minutes are remaining in the session. All attendees will be muted at the start of the meeting. Please type your questions in chat and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. So I will turn it over to the presenters and let's get started.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Marcus mentioned, my name is Liz Graham, and I am at the University of Maryland. However, I'm no stranger to the WLC. Prior to my current position, I was actually at Georgetown University Law Library for several years, so it's really nice to be back among my former colleagues. Before we get started, I really wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for being here with us today. I mean, even in the best of times, library and leadership are important things to talk about, but given everything I'm sure our institutions have had to endure these past few weeks, it seems even more important to talk about it now. On a personal note, today's conversation really combines two of my favorite things, leadership in libraries and sitting in sweatpants. So I could share that with all of you today. But honestly, on a more serious note, I do want to thank the WLC for all the work they put into making sure this meeting could happen online. I think it takes a lot of work to really make something like this happen. And so on behalf of myself and the panel, we really are grateful to be here with all of you this afternoon. So I think our plan today, regardless of the format, was always to have a really open and honest conversation about leadership in libraries and how we plan that out for the next generation. And so we're going to do our best today to bring that to you in this new medium. And I'm really excited to be able to really talk to two people who are leaders in their field. As Marcus mentioned, Emily Florio is the Senior Research Services Manager at Hogan Lovells, but she's also the Vice President, President-elect of the American Association of Law Libraries. And then we have, Christina Alayan, who is the Director and Assistant Professor of Law at Howard University. That's what I'm going to say for now. I'm going to give our two panelists some time to talk a bit about themselves and how they came to the positions they're in right now. And then we'll be sure to leave some time at the end for your questions. So Christina, do you want to start?
Sure.
Talking a bit about how you got into libraryship and leadership.
Yeah, so I'll do the quick and dirty version. The way I got into librarianship was pretty much by accident. So this was not, and I'm jealous of folks who knew right away that this was something they wanted to do. I had worked in libraries, ironically enough, all through my undergraduate and graduate degrees. So I have a bachelor's and then a master's in library information science, but also a law degree. And so when I was in law school, I also worked in the library. And it wasn't until I actually interacted more with the law library director and then some of the other law librarians there who had the law degree and then the strange degree, the MLIS. And unlike all the attorneys I kept interacting with, the librarians were really happy and really professionally fulfilled. And so it just seemed like a natural fit. So straight after law school, I went right into library school and never looked back. So that was essentially my path. And it truly, I'm just so fortunate that it worked out the way it did, because there's no better place for me in terms of how rewarding this has been. So now I've been working in libraries for a little over 20 years, if you count all of the work as a student as well. In terms of leadership, I've been working sort of really intentionally to cultivate management experience. So I had management experience before I moved into libraries, but as soon as I was looking at library programs, I purposefully selected a program that sort of touted itself as one that curates or cultivates leadership. So that was something I did at the outset. And then from there, my first job was as a foreign comparative international law librarian at a university. So sort of a subject specialist, I guess. And I adored the work that I was doing, but sort of at the 3 to 5 year window was getting like management itchiness. Like I wanted to take on more, and there just wasn't enough room for that for me where I was. So I ended up jumping to Georgetown, which is actually where I met Liz, and was the head of content acquisitions and management there for a minute and a half, then became the head of reference, and then from there jumped into my current position as the law library director at Howard.
Emily.
Hi, everybody. And bear with me, I have a little bit of a cough, but I'll try and get through this. I am Emily Florio. I'm really happy to be here with Liz and Christina, or here, I should say. I am also an accidental librarian, even though I'm a second-generation librarian. My mom was an elementary school librarian at my school growing up, so I certainly knew about libraries, went to her library all the time. She was my librarian, so I obviously went to hers. Knew the public library, and actually, much like Christina, worked in my undergrad library and worked in public libraries, actually at a public library near where I grew up. My mom walked in one summer. Mind you, I'm from a small town, so everybody knew everybody. And they said, "Oh, does Emily need a job this summer?" And I did. And that library, which was a small public library, and I got to do everything, is really the reason I think that I ended up being a librarian, because I realized I liked it. And then I'm also an accidental law librarian. Even in library school, I thought that I would be in academia or a public library because that's what I knew. And then I was applying for any job possible and ended up at a law firm, and I've been with firms for 15 years. So nothing was on purpose, but I am very, very happy. So I didn't start at the assistant level, but sort of a step above that at my first law firm, in document delivery and retrieval, back when we still sent a runner to, I worked in Boston at the time, libraries to get copies of articles and books. And then sort of that role expanded into managing resources and intranet content and things like that. And I think management also happened accidentally. We used the Northeastern co-op program, and so I had a co-op that worked with me but not for me, and that was sort of my introduction to management, and then it just went from there. I had the guy who hired me sort of would just give me work, and I think without realizing it, I got into management because he just gave me work to do. And so I was at that firm for 8 years, and then I moved to a firm here in DC, where I managed a team for about 6 years. And then about 7 months ago, I joined Hogan Lovells, where I manage our research team of about 12 folks across the US. And so it's not managing the whole team, it's managing just the researchers, but it's quite a large team across the US, and I even report to someone in London. So it's been sort of just a little bit of a switch and a different type of leadership within my organization. But I've been really happy since I've been in DC. I've met Liz and Christina, so it's been great.
So I think I want to talk a little bit about, there's this misconception that really leadership is reserved at the very top. And I think, for both Christina and Emily, you weren't always in the senior positions that you were. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about when you were maybe, in the beginning or the middle of your careers, how you really went about trying to get those leadership opportunities.
So I'll jump right in. There's a couple things that happened. One which is passive and then the other is active. In the passive sense, I was really lucky at the outset that I had some great managers, almost a little bit what Emily was referring to as people who saw potential in me. And so they were giving me sort of opportunities to grow in a management capacity, and I welcomed it. So I sort of passively received these opportunities and then took advantage of them. In a more active or proactive way, I worked really hard to identify projects where I could say I took the lead on a project. Another thing that I think a lot of us have opportunities to do is outside even the bounds of our sort of 9 to 5 job, or whatever the hours are, I guess. If you're a member of a professional organization, oftentimes there's opportunities to take on management roles there, and it can even be beyond a project. It can be the chair, you could be like Emily, the president or vice president, so there are all these really great opportunities. The only thing I would say where there's a little bit of a caveat is, depending on the resources of your institution or your library, membership may be something that's harder to come by. In the event that that's true, and I've sort of worked at sort of more well-resourced institutions and then sort of less well-resourced, there's still plenty of opportunities if you're willing to put in the time and be a little bit scrappy, where you can identify different kinds of funding that may subsidize those sorts of opportunities so that you can still continue to grow. And then as you, presumably enter opportunities to, either take on a formal management role within your institution or go elsewhere, you can point to all these things that you've done and really talk about how you purposefully been cultivating these experiences, purposefully cultivating this management experience. Because there are a few times where I've encountered opportunities where there are people who sort of have been at an institution for several years, maybe 5 or more years, and a management position becomes available, and they just assume, well, I've been here longer than anyone else, so I'm necessarily the best candidate. And then I'm looking at their sort of experience, and it's clear that they've never gone out of their sort of rote job responsibilities to take on, whether it's a project or a management certificate or, any of those things that often, particularly in academia, are something that we can take advantage of. So I think it's more than just thinking about what can you do today, but thinking about the fact that your future self will potentially need to explain to someone why you're a good fit. And if you say, well, it's just because I've been here for a long time, that's not going to cut it.
And I'll take that a little bit too. It makes me think at our conference, so like Christina said, I'm the vice president of the American Association of Law Libraries, AALL, if I happen to slip that in. Mm-hmm. At our conference last year, there was a program that was called something like, it's okay to not want to be a manager or something like that. Yeah. And I think that is sometimes a tricky thing that people run into, both of their own accord, but also sometimes their supervisors. It isn't cut out for everyone. And there's nothing wrong if you don't want to if you don't want to be a supervisor or a manager. And I think sometimes because someone's been there so long that it seems like the next step, but it turns out that sometimes people just don't want to do it, and then they're sometimes a little angry or bitter that they have to. So that's something I've learned, just to think about those things before you assume someone with tenure is necessarily the best person for the position. And I guess somewhat early on was managing a process. I was managing document delivery and managing an intern. Mm-hmm. And I wish I'd known a lot of things back then. And I've learned from very good managers, and I've also learned a significant amount from some not great some not great managers. And I find that when things are dire, which sometimes they are, whether it's for myself or a friend or somebody that's going through that, is to try and make a positive moment out of it and think like, okay, well, I'm learning something on how not to be. Like, I never want anyone to feel this way about me in their life. But I hope you all never have to go through that, ever.
No, none of us have bad managers. That's not a thing.
Never. But I think both of your answers really touch on something. I mean, Christina, you talked a bit about the opportunities that were presented to you or having come across accidentally and you found yourself in charge of a process. Since we're talking about cultivating leadership in the next generation, how does that really inform the way that you manage your teams now? And how do you go about creating those opportunities for people who want them, or in some, you know, in maybe some cases, having to explain to people that maybe this isn't the best for them? About managing that.
I'll go first. So I have a pretty big team. Everybody is a research analyst, so they do research for both practice areas, but across the firm and across our offices. And there are sort of, I guess, smaller opportunities for people to sort of step up. We do have a big project going on now. We're implementing a current awareness platform globally. So it's a very visible project for our team. And everyone on the team will be touched by it and work with it. But there are 3 people from my direct team on the larger team. And it is a chance on sort of a micro level for those people to step up and lead. In one of the cases, actually our newest hire is leading one of the groups within the team, and she's doing a great job. So even though she's the most junior person on the team and the newest on the team, but everything about the way she's been going about it is like she has a million years of experience under her belt. So it's been a very good example of giving someone a shot, even if she isn't maybe the most likely candidate. And we also have other projects that come up through the year. And so I'm trying to spread out these projects across the team so everybody might have their hand in something. And it is a chance to see on a bigger level who can get what you need when you need it. I would say the other thing that I spend some time thinking about is how people approach both their individual work, but then the work of the team. Since I think one sign of a potential good leader on any level is that they're thinking about the whole team. It's not, I guess, for example, right, we're dealing with a bit of a crisis right now as a nation, and our office is open, but we're allowed to work remotely. You know, and some people are like, oh, I'm happy to go into the office if something comes up because it can only be accessed on the Bloomberg terminal that's in the office, right? Because they have the flexibility to, and they can. And then I have other people that are, willing to step up in a different way that doesn't require them to go into the office. But I guess I look for those little things, but that overall somebody's approach is less about their personal coverage and also how they can help the whole team.
Just to make sure I got the question right, is it, as a manager, how am I cultivating leadership in the people who report to me?
Yeah.
The idea. So I think that's a really interesting question. One of the conversations I've had at different points with folks is how sometimes really good managers are described differently by different people who report to them. So you might have a staff member who really benefits from or I would say, I actually think this is true in general. I think people benefit from discomfort. I think discomfort is actually what challenges us to be creative, and it sort of forces us to sort of think outside the box. I think when we sort of do the assembly line style of work, there's comfort in that and there's predictability in that. But it also makes things like what's happening right now really difficult to navigate for folks who really crave that predictability. And so building some discomfort and pressure points into the management relationship, I think, can be really productive. I think there's ways that can really backfire, but if it's done in a way that is built on mutual trust and respect, which takes a lot of time and a lot of work, you don't just get that out of the box. I think you can have these relationships where staff feel like they're both valued as they exist now, but that you see potential in them to do more and better. And that has to, I think, be different for everyone. So if I have a staff member who's incredibly good at, building policies and thinking about every single permutation of an issue, that's a skill I don't need to worry about developing in them, but maybe somebody else tends to just have a really cursory response to any sort of thing that comes their way. Is there maybe a partnership where I can bring those two people together where they'll learn from each other? One may learn to be a little bit more efficient with their work, and then the other one will see value in sort of thinking things beyond just step one knee-jerk reaction. So I guess the short version of that is to say, building teams and opportunities and projects for different folks to work together so they can learn from each other. And other things can be really targeted. So I really believe in the annual review process. I think a lot of people understandably hate it and resent it. But I think when it's done in a predictable way, where we know every year this is a thing that we do, we come up with goals, and then throughout the year we touch base to make sure people are on target, and that they're letting us know if they're encountering any issues. And then at the end of that year, we can evaluate, how things went. But the most important part in that process, in my opinion, is the actual drafting of the goals at the outset. As a manager in an ideal world, I love staff who have ideas about what they want to do, but that they're thinking of themselves as part of a larger organism. So I've had some staff who've put together goals that are really sort of self-interested. And that doesn't necessarily preclude a benefit for the organization, but sometimes it does. And in those instances, those goals aren't going to fly, so we have to take those out. But when I can see evidence of them thinking like, this is something that benefits me, maybe this training that I'm really interested in, but it's also something I can bring back to the library, or I can then train other people. Those sorts of things I get really excited about. And if my staff are struggling to come up with those sorts of things, then I see my job as a manager as inviting that sort of thinking, or offering sort of examples that help them sort of head in that direction if they're uncomfortable or unable to do that on their own. And if there's some discomfort in the goal, that's usually a good thing. That means you're growing, that means you're learning. But it's your manager's job to be there for you as you're going through that learning process.
So I think, again, both of your answers really highlight something that I'd like us to move forward to now. Leadership is often thought of as, you have to be strong in these certain areas, right? I think more often than not, we talk about leadership in very kind of limited ways. When I think, there are a whole slew of skills that really make good leaders. So if each of you could talk about really what leadership means to you and what skills you really think you bring as a leader to your institution. Easy question, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So what are the qualities of a good leader? I think in some ways we probably all have different answers. I think two sort of concepts occur to me. One, which is maybe unconventional, is humility. And what I mean by that is leaders who don't recognize that they don't have all the answers will inevitably make mistakes, and they will sort of inevitably turn people away who may have really good ideas that they'd benefit from hearing. So on the one hand, that doesn't mean you're not confident, and that doesn't mean you're not capable of making difficult decisions or being firm, but it means that you're cultivating a culture in which your team can ask questions and say, hey, it looks like we're putting together this policy, but I saw this gap, or I'm concerned about this issue. I want and benefit from my team raising those issues for me. And if I don't have a culture in which people understand that I value that I'm not going to be defensive about it, or that I don't think that it's somehow, questioning my authority, that's a good thing for me and for my team and the work that we do. The only thing that it doesn't preclude, That doesn't mean I welcome people being rude to me or like questioning my authority. That's a different thing entirely. But I absolutely benefit from my team's expertise. As an example, the person who's doing the cataloging, that's the expert in cataloging, not me. She needs to let me know what issues she's encountering. She needs to let me know if the things that I'm doing are going to impact her and her work in a negative way that I failed to anticipate. And so if I don't have a culture in which she can do that, then I'm failing in my job. I was going to say a second one, but I forget what it is. So I'll let Emily chime in and maybe it'll come back to me.
I guess sort of on the note of humility, it's someone who can accept and admit to their own limitations, or maybe like I think about it in myself, and one of the traits that I'm better at accepting as I get older is that I'm not always the most patient person, but I know that, and so I can sort of I'm better able to deal with things or just say that up front, I guess. So someone that can accept whatever their known limitations are, but like Christina said, it's also sometimes what you lean on other people for, whether it's a character trait or something like cataloging where you're not the expert and you know that you have someone else that you can lean on. And I would say too, especially since everything is changing all the time, and I don't just mean what we're dealing with in the present moment, but someone who's really willing to listen and willing to learn, not just about leadership or management, but about whatever field you're in or topic or whatever the thing is of the moment, because none of us will ever know everything. Mm-hmm. And so there is a lot to learn. I put a lot of emphasis on continuing education, both in my own life, but also for members of my team, since there's always something to learn, and I just value that when people are so willing to embark on that or ask for opinions on what they should do next or things like that.
And I remembered my second one, which you touched on too, Emily, which is self-awareness, right? So, I mean, these are all sort of related qualities, but the idea with self-awareness is if I know, what my qualities are, if I know that I'm impatient, or in my case, for example, this surprises some people, but I'm not a super feelings person. So some things don't occur to me to do that really matter to other people. And it's not that my way is better. It's just not I don't have that chip programmed in me. So for example, I had a staff member who was out sick or something like that. And he remarked to my deputy director that I had failed to check in with him when he came back to make sure that he was okay. And that's just not part of something that I would typically think to do, is to check in with every staff member after they come back from being sick. But it's also not hard for me to do. So if someone reminds me, or someone says, hey, such and such staff member is back, if you feel, when you have time, stop by their office and check in, I am so happy to do that. So now when something like this happens, my deputy director is phenomenal in her feelings. And so I've flagged it for her and say, please remind me to check in with staff member when they come back, or frankly, if there's any other reason why you think this staff member might benefit from having me stop by, because it is my job to make sure my staff feel seen and heard in whatever way they need to see and hear it, even if it's not part of my sort of natural day-to-day way of thinking or doing. So I think that's really, really important. And that doesn't mean to say, if my staff member says they're only going to feel seen and heard if they get a $10,000 raise, I can't do that. But, that doesn't mean I shouldn't know it. So I think those are the types of things that if you're willing to acknowledge that you don't have 100% of all the things for all the people, because no one does, then you're better able to actually account for those things, not only in yourself, but also in your team. So you can build teams that balance each other out. So I don't need another Christina in my library. I need another, in my case, my deputy director, Eileen, who has qualities that come naturally to her that don't come naturally to me. So I need a foil, right? So I think that's another important piece, is you're building teams, is you can't really account for that if you're not actually aware of the qualities you do and don't have.
And can I say one thing? So the three of us have done a version of this presentation before, and what Christina just said reminded me of something that was really popular when we did this before. which I'm going to relate back to a trait. I think being flexible and being open is good too. And I remember what we were talking about was, I think, how do we reward, I think it was like, how do we reward our teams when you don't always, when you can't necessarily give them the $10,000 raise or bonus. And something we were talking about was birthdays.
Yeah.
And how, like, I've worked in some places where I could just order a $50 gift card, no problem, and give it to everybody on the team, and no one ever asked twice. But then I've also worked in places where you don't have that kind of flexibility and the team is too spread out. So you don't even do, we don't currently do like cake or cupcakes for somebody's birthday. But that you ask the individual what would it mean to them? Like, do you acknowledge it at a team meeting? Some people would love that. Some people would be devastated by that. Right. So it's, and that this whole idea I hadn't thought about it much until the three of us talked about it previously. So it's being flexible. And yes, sometimes people are going to give you ideas that aren't relevant. And honestly, that I'm like, oh God, I can't believe that they gave me that idea. But then they're also going to have really good ones. So it's being flexible, but it's also being aware and honest and listening to what people have to say. That it, sometimes, yes, you're going to hear things that are really off base, but other times, it's going to matter a lot to the person that you just sat down and listened.
Right.
I have so many questions left, but I want to make sure we also have time for people to ask at the end. So we're going to do 2 more questions, because in the spirit of open and honest, which I think both of you have been, whether it's been about, being self-aware or the things that we're not good at, which is really hard to admit sometimes. Could you maybe tell us a time in your career where you've just done something that ended up being wrong? It was a mishap. It was a wrong step, and what you've learned from that and how you've, taken that information.
I can think of a couple examples, but I'll just give one, because they're both kind of the same in general anyway, which is that there have been instances where I took for granted that something was easy or even good. And then when I tried to roll it out to my team, it turned out that it, to them, was neither easy nor good, so and so then I was sort of shocked, because there of course are the things that as a manager, like, oh, this is going to be tough for my team. And so you think about all the different ways you can roll it out. And do I need to talk to them individually? Is it better as a group, a combination, et cetera, et cetera? But if you've miscalculated and you're like, oh no, this thing I'm going to roll out is going to be so well received. And then you find out that they hate it. And so more generally, I guess I would say is just sort of not making that assumption to begin with, that everybody has different reactions to everything. And one example which is sort of different, but so I, for example, love change. I love chaos. I love sort of the ambiguity. I love solutions, thinking on the fly, being creative. A lot of people don't. My husband's one of them. He can't stand change. If he could do the same thing for the rest of his life, he would be so happy. And I'm the opposite. If I did the same thing for the rest of my life, I'd go nuts. And so to come back to sort of your original question, in my case, it was that I had started to roll out a proposal to my team of streamlining statistics, right? Because I hate tracking things all the time. Of course, everyone hates tracking things all the time. No, it turns out that the people on the team that I was rolling this out to really tied their value and the work that they do to the numbers, to the hash marks. So they saw tremendous value. And so in proposing that we either streamline or even in some instances eliminate tracking something was terribly damaging to them and was a really big misstep in my case. And I was able to recover, and we ended up not, I totally pedaled. But it was really one of those cases where I had, misread a thing. And the mistake really was that I made an assumption that others would necessarily think the same way I do about something. And that's obviously not the case.
Mine is somewhat similar, at a job that I took where I didn't ask outright how the team was and if there was going to be the need for a lot of team change. that it turned out that I was getting a team that essentially I cut in half in 5 years. It was an overinflated team that needed to adjust to what the modern times were and what we needed from those positions. And so I had to make a lot of staffing changes. And the team was really sort of, it was a pretty big split between researchers on one side and technical services on the other. A majority of the researchers were all professional degreed librarians. Technical services were not. And this really more drastically impacted the technical services team, who for the most part were underperforming anyway, and to the extent where there were researchers saying sort of disparaging things about tech services. We went through these changes. Oh, it was a mess. I learned a lot at that place. And so even though it was really clear to everyone that these changes needed to happen, and they did slowly over a 3-year period, I totally underestimated the impact that these staffing changes would have on the larger team. I think people lost faith in me, I think, if it was there in the first place. But it was sort of a sticky situation because it was clear to me within my first month there that a lot of change needed to happen. And so how do you balance, needing this change to happen, but also keeping people on your side? And I'm not sure that there is an easy answer, but I underestimated how it would go.
Right.
And it was pretty tough. So yeah, I think that's still the big thing.
So we already have one question in the queue, but it would feel disingenuous for us not to talk a little bit about leadership during a time like the COVID-19 response, right? I think a lot of institutions were asked to make some really hard decisions really quickly. And so as a leader at your respective institutions, how have you gone about managing your library's response? And really, how are you coaching your team through a time that is both kind of uncertain at work and then uncertain in life?
So I have a couple of things. So I think it's been really interesting as a law library director because we have a number of, I'm sure this is true across all sectors. So we have a number of different listservs, right? So there is a listserv for academic law library directors. And so it was really interesting as this was evolving. A lot of us were talking to each other, both within the context of this national listserv, and then sort of we had pockets separately, either where we're texting each other or whatever. So there was this really amazing informal ability for this group to collaborate, and as we each came up with ideas to share them with each other. And so that was happening within our sector, and I found that exchange to be not only incredibly rewarding but also really exciting. So like I mentioned earlier, I actually like change. I like challenges. So I find these to be really great opportunities. I know not everybody is the same, but the fact that that was sort of my gut reaction to this whole evolving situation, I think helped me, and then by extension helped my team, because I was framing things not as things to be afraid of, but as opportunities for us to rise to the occasion. That doesn't mean my staff didn't have completely valid concerns or totally valid fears, ranging from how do we maintain services to personal health and safety concerns. And of course, it's my job and my position to hear those things, address those things, while maintaining, the administrative responsibilities that the largest department on campus, in the law school rather, has. So unlike a lot of, I shouldn't say unlike a lot of, I have so many different thoughts about this, but basically one of the things that Howard, I feel like, did really, really well is we had a really great and consistent communications strategy. And it wasn't, I don't just say strategy because that's what I think it was. We called it that. So it was understood that there was a communications strategy, and it was coming from the top. So the president of the university was dictating the messaging, and then each of us within our respective units was echoing that that communication strategy. And then each of us at the various leadership levels were meeting regularly with our counterparts. And so there was just a lot of really important communication happening up and down the chain. A lot of regular staff weren't seeing that and weren't a party to those conversations, nor should they be. But it was important that I convey to them that these things were happening, that I let them know which issues we were addressing, that as soon as information or a policy became available, I was communicating that down. And more importantly, that I was also preparing my staff for inevitable changes. So in our case, I think this is true for a lot of places, we were saying, we're open, we're adjusting services slightly, but we're still open. And then all of a sudden a hammer dropped and it's, no, we're not open physically, but we're still maintaining services. Even though nobody was saying that that hammer was going to drop, I was preparing for the hammer. So that meant things like telling my staff, if there's anything you need from work, you should be taking it with you in case they end up saying that the campus is closed. So things like that, where I was preparing my staff, developing policies, having contingencies in place, even though I wasn't necessarily hearing that from the folks on high.
And I'll add just a little bit that same, it was sort of knowing that, feeling that this was going to get more serious. This was last week, and checking in with everybody. I have both a mix of people with young kids at home and those without, and sort of having sort of various levels to deal with and getting their issues addressed first, since that was going to be the first sort of big issue. And just trying to keep the chain of communication open with everyone, and knowing that some people would feel comfortable going into the office. We can optionally work from home. It's not mandatory yet as of today, but I had someone that went in. So sort of someone on my team has asked me to like put out some guidance, and I think it's difficult at this point to put out guidance knowing that it's changing all the time. So sort of saying, okay, well, yes, most of our services are available online. Let's deal with anything that requires an in-person visit on a case-by-case basis to determine if someone is in at that time. Do we really need someone to go into the office? Things like that. So rather than trying to have all the questions or all the unknown questions answered up front, taking it a sort of bit by bit.
Sorry to interrupt. We have about 4 minutes left.
Okay. So I will jump to one of the audience questions, and it is, effective communication skill is one of the most powerful in leadership. How do you see this skill in engaging staff members and motivating them to get the best results? Any examples?
I mean, I think we both talked a little bit about communication strategy from the perspective of sort of this, rapidly evolving and unpredictable situation that we all find ourselves in. I think the questions, so I think some of that we talked about already. I think the piece that maybe is a different angle is sort of this idea of how can communication be used as a mechanism to motivate. That's really an interesting idea. I think almost going back to what I was talking about earlier about the annual review process, I think that's a really formal communications mechanism that's really predictable and allows us to collaboratively develop goals that are in service of not only the library's mission, but then also the mission of the institution, right? So once all of those things are in alignment, ideally we're developing in this collaborative process goals that not only serve the interests of the individual staff members, that's sort of the motivational piece, but then also that it plugs directly into what it is we're trying to accomplish as an organization. Now, I've had situations where we have a goal at the library level that maybe a staff member doesn't like, right? So maybe they actually don't have any interest in aligning with whatever our goals and strategies are for that year. And that's, I think, where that motivational or communication piece may be really important. And as much as possible, I will always try to align my goals with the interests and skills of a staff member. But at the end of the day, if it needs to get done and it's part of their job and it's part of the work that we need to do, if they can't, find their motivation, they're still going to have to do it. So it's not sort of an option like of whether you can do your job. That obviously has to happen whether you're motivated to do it or not. And an absolute worst case scenario, I mean, if you're not willing to do what needs to get done at a motivational level, then there should be consequences. And I think in some, libraries, we're not always really good about having consequences or having a clear communication process that not only holds staff accountable, but gives them opportunities to course correct. Because there are a lot of folks who say, well, if only I had known, not just at the end of the year, but if someone had told me, in January that I was failing to meet my goals, I would have done something different. So that is a really important, and that's a management responsibility. If people don't know that they're failing to meet their obligations, that absolutely is on management.
And the one thing I'll say is that I do have some people, I think that they've never had a manager that sort of guided them any other way. And so trying to be sensitive to that, but also give them advice and guidance on how to be more effective. I think about this a lot with some of my folks who really only communicate through email, and how we can improve on our email, since not only does it reflect on them, but it reflects on our larger team. And not only do we want to be effective, but we want to be professional and as helpful as possible. So sometimes a longer email isn't as good as a shorter email with bullet points or something like that. So sometimes I think it even is just going back to basics.
I love the executive summary.
All right, well, I think that is all of our time. Thank you everyone for spending the last 45 minutes with us. As you can see, the three of us could talk about this all day long, but we don't have all day. So thank you everyone.
I would just add one thing, for folks who have any questions, I think for any of us after the end of this program, you're welcome to reach out to us by email. I think you can find all of us really easily, and we're happy to chat offline.
Absolutely. Thanks for bearing with us today, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks to our speakers. I'll go ahead and stop the recording and start the next session. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.